All right, well, we're going to start now with our first of a number of nutrients that we're going to talk about throughout the course of the semester. This one's nitrogen, and it's a big one, and we're going to spend essentially the next 2 weeks on nitrogen alone because of the significance of nitrogen. So there exists this great paradox on planet Earth um, of nitrogen abundance and limitation. And so nitrogen, N2 or dinitrogen, constitutes about 80% of the Earth's atmosphere. 78% of the Earth's atmosphere is made up of this one gas, N2. But if we look around, nearly all terrestrial ecosystems are primarily nitrogen limited. So we can look at, this is particularly true in temperate regions, but can be true in tropical ecosystems as well. We look at deciduous forests here in Ohio. We go out to tallgrass prairie, the short steppe prairie, lots of different terrestrial ecosystems. Nitrogen is the primary limitation. What I mean by that is that it is the nutrient that limits productivity or total plant growth the most. And this is, of course, not very true, very consistent in agriculture as well, where nitrogen is the primary limiting nutrient. So, the question of this paradox is, how can this possibly be when nitrogen, we're really literally swimming in the sea, this atmosphere of nitrogen, but it's just not available. And, that is really, of course, the answer. It's that the form of nitrogen that exists, this N2 gas, is very, very difficult for life, for organisms to access, right? And if you look at the approximate, the table here, this is from the Haviland textbook, just the approximate distribution of nitrogen through the plant, soil, atmosphere, animal system. This is a kind of on a global scale. And you can just see how vast majority N occurs in the atmosphere, about 0.5% in the sea, and then it just really tapers off after that. So, this is the idea that nitrogen is this very, very important compound, very important nutrient, but it's very difficult for living organisms to actually acquire it in a form that they need. So form is important, right? And N2, or dinitrogen, has this triple bond, right? So we can think about single bond in chemistry, a double bond, or a triple bond. Triple bond, there's a lot of energy that is required to break this triple bond. And that's the rub, really. It takes a tremendous amount of enzymatic energy, and the right enzymes actually do this, okay? So N2 must be converted to plant-available nitrogen by a number of processes. So kind of first and foremost, microorganisms that live symbiotically on legume roots. So this is the idea of legumes and rhizobia. Things like soybeans or clovers, these have nitrogen associations and special nodules. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There's free-living or non-symbiotic microorganisms. In a general sense, the group that is able, both free-living and non-symbiotic or in a symbiotic relationship, microorganisms that are able to essentially break this triple bond are called diazotrophs. So they're capable enzymatically of actually breaking this triple bond and making it plant available. Okay. There's also atmospheric discharges that form nitrous oxide, so these giant bursts of energy, and that's kind of a major theme, that it requires a lot of energy to break this triple bond, whether that comes from microorganisms, whether it comes from a lightning strike, or more recently, as it comes from the manufacture of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. And that's, of course, a major source of fertilizer today, or a major source of nitrogen today. So nitrogen is very, very important because it's typically the most abundant nutrient in plants. We've seen this already. Nitrogen is our element in blue here. Primary forms are this nitrate and ammonium that's taken up. Primarily comes from organic matter of the atmosphere. And then this is, again, a very ballpark number of 1.5%, anywhere between 1 and 6%, or even less, depending on the plant part, and, et cetera, et cetera. So we can compare that with other nutrients, and nitrogen is, kind of in the highest concentration in plants. So why is nitrogen so important? Why this nutrient? Why not any another nutrient? Things like oxygen or aluminum. These are really readily abundant in the Earth's surface. Why nitrogen? Well, plants really have more nitrogen than any other nutrient. We just talked about that, and it's because it serves a lot of different functions. So enzymatically or biochemically, nitrogen is important for a lot of different things. We use nitrogen, or plants use nitrogen to manufacture amino acids and proteins. This is enzymes, proteins. These are the same reason that nitrogen is important for human nutrition. It's in DNA and RNA. It's in that genetic information. So we need nitrogen to do the most fundamental thing in biology, which is reproduce and pass down genetic information, right? It's a really important component in chlorophyll. And it's important for the energetic currency of plants. So this idea of ADP and ATP, this adenosine tri and diphosphate. Talk a little bit more about that with phosphorus, but these are hopefully terms that you're familiar with from earlier coursework. So, nitrogen functions a lot of different things in plants. We talked about this and moving on. So we mentioned chlorophyll, and this is, from an agricultural context, is typically what we often think of in terms of the role of nitrogen and how we assess if a plant is nitrogen limited or if it's nitrogen satisfied, if it's sufficient or deficient in nitrogen. So this idea that with a lot of nitrogen, there's high photosynthetic activity, high vegetative growth, and dark green color. Here we have a diagram or a molecular schematic of chlorophyll. Interestingly, it's a magnesium molecule with 4 nitrogens associated with that, and then a whole bunch of carbon, hydrogen, oxygens. Okay, so this might not seem like a lot of nitrogen, but for 4 nitrogens really concentrate like that, it's a very nitrogen-rich molecule. And if there's not, if the plant doesn't have access to a lot of nitrogen, it's not making a lot of chlorophyll. And so that's one of the ideas. Nitrogen supplies influence carbohydrate utilization, so how efficient plants are in terms of building, respiring, maintaining carbohydrates, okay? So under low N circumstances, carbohydrates can be deposited in vegetative cells, causing them to thicken in the cell walls. And when nitrogen supplies are adequate or the conditions turn more favorable, proteins are formed from this quote-unquote stored carbohydrate. So essentially, like, we can think of it as kind of storing fat in plants, or storing energy source, maybe not fat, but energy sources. And that is, again, passed down or remobilized and turned into enzymatic energy when nitrogen becomes sufficient or becomes available. So forms of nitrogen. We talked a little bit about how forms are important, and we can broadly classify nitrogen in the form of nitrogen, in organic or inorganic. So we'll talk about this term a lot in this course. Inorganic meaning that it does not have a carbon backbone, and organic meaning that it is associated with some kind of carbon backbone. So this is kind of like an organic chem or biochem kind of concept. And when we talk about organic and inorganic in this course, it's typically not going to be certified organic, that kind of farming practice, but it's going to be related to if this nutrient has this organic carbon backbone or not. Okay, so inorganic forms, things like atmospheric nitrogen, N2 gas, ammonia, NH3, nitrous oxides, which are N2O or NO, and then ammonium NH4 plus. Okay, so let's not confuse ammonia NH3 with ammonium NH4. That's an important distinction. And nitrate NO3 minus. And then of course there's nitrite, which is kind of a species of nitrate. But really, ammonium and nitrate, NH4 plus and NO3 minus, are the two primary forms of nitrogen that plants take up. The chemical forms are sketched here, ammonium and nitrate. Plants take up other forms of nitrogen. They take up ammonia directly. They take up simple, small, low molecular weight, small molecular weight, dissolved organic nitrogen compounds. There's a number of different ways, and depending on the species, etc., depending on the environment. But without a doubt, the two ways or the two forms of nitrogen that plants take up are these two, ammonium and nitrate, and that's the reality. So that's the inorganic form. And then the organic form is essentially organic matter, the nitrogen that's in organic matter. So what does that mean? Well, amino acids or proteins, they can be amino sugars, they can be acid insoluble, there can be a lot of different forms. There's a huge chemical complexity of organic matter and the nitrogen that exists in organic matter. Okay, so we can look at, again, thinking about nitrogen, this is primarily the types of compounds that we're going to find in plants, in roots, in microorganisms, in all the microbiota that live in the soil. And then in that kind of dead organic matter that's going through various decomposition processes. And so, a general estimate, of course not consistent across all soils, but most soils, the total nitrogen in the soil is a huge percentage is in this organic form. Okay, so just a small percentage that's in these forms that plants might take up, ammonium nitrate, and the very large majority, maybe 90, 95 or greater percent, is in this organic form. So nitrogen is by nature an organic compound. It has a carbon backbone the vast majority of the time when we find it in the soil. Okay, so let's talk just briefly about nitrogen uptake in plants. We already mentioned that plants take up both nitrate and ammonium. Ammonium is quote-unquote a better source of nitrogen because it's already in this reduced form. Okay, for plants to use nitrate, they first have to reduce it from its oxidized form. Okay, so this is another concept that hopefully is familiar to you, but just in case, we'll talk about reduced forms and oxidized forms. So a classic example is say a carbohydrate. Let's take carbon. And a carbohydrate is a reduced form of carbon. In other words, it is a form that has energy associated in those bonds, and the oxygen is absent. And then an oxidized form of carbon, when we harvest or want to enzymatically harvest that energy in a carbohydrate with oxygen, we combust that essentially. That's the process of respiration. And CO2 is the product. So carbon dioxide is the oxidized form of a carbohydrate. And the same concept where we've got ammonium and nitrate. Ammonium is the reduced form and nitrate is this oxidized form. Okay, and going down the line, nitrate is in kind of a lower energy state than ammonium. And so if a plant wants to use, take in nitrogen and use it, it's basically got to convert it to this reduced form in order to incorporate it into things and manufacture it for like proteins, amino acids, stuff like that. So reducing from nitrate to ammonium requires energy and enzymes. So this is why, we would think that, plants would preferentially take up ammonium all the time over nitrate because enzymatically it's advantageous. Reality is that plants take up both, and they've evolved to take up both. In most warm, well-aerated soils, nitrate occurs in much larger quantities than nitrite. Virtually all agricultural systems that we enter, we sample soil, we measure nitrate, we measure ammonium. There's almost always higher levels, sometimes, in order of magnitude, 10 part per million versus 1 part per million, or 20 part per million versus a half part per million of nitrate to ammonia, respectively. So nutrient solutions in like a greenhouse environment often will call for something like 75 nitrate, 25% ammonium in terms of the form of fertilizer, the nitrogen source, as a rule of thumb, but that's certainly not always the case. It just depends, but that's something that happens. So the preference for nitrate and ammonium differs between plants. Most plants do better with both. They've evolved seeing both, and they're used to taking both up. And so giving a plant one versus the other is often perfectly fine, but plants, I don't know if they prefer or whatever, but they do better oftentimes, not always, with both. Okay, so let's just break down this idea of if a plant takes up nitrate and then it has to convert it to ammonia or ammonium for actually to use it. And that is a really important step in plant biochemistry, plant physiology. And it's mediated through this nitrate reductase reaction. And this has two steps. Step 1 goes from nitrate NO3 minus to nitrite NO2 minus. And the second step is nitrite to ammonia NH3. Okay, so the reaction occurs in a series because plants have a very low tolerance for nitrite. This says that toxic nitrate, but it should say toxic nitrite does not accumulate. Okay, I'll fix that in the slide. Sorry about that. Ammonium produced is assimilated into amino acids that are combined to proteins, nucleic acids, etc. So NH3, this ammonium, and we'll talk about this here in a bit, it's really the building block of a lot of nitrogen compounds, and it's certainly the building block of nitrogen fertilizer that we use. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk about the nitrogen cycle. Now, this is a lot to throw at you, and I realize that, but it's really important, and we don't have to be overwhelmed, but let's just walk through this, point by point, and talk about this a little bit. It's really critically important if you're thinking about working in the field of soil fertility or any sort of, soil in general. This is just a fundamental piece, and a lot of these terms are kind of thrown around, and it's really good to kind of have a solid grasp on this, okay, moving forward. So, not that anyone wants to sit here and memorize it. It's not the most exciting thing, I recognize, but it is critically important. So, we can think about this in a number of different ways, but let's just kind of go through here linearly. This is from the Haviland textbook, and we're going to be pointing to the respective numbers in this figure, right? So this is our glorious nitrogen cycle. You've likely seen it before, but we have sources. We have new sources of nitrogen, okay? We just talked about these: fertilizer, legumes, lightning, rainfall. These are ways that nitrogen, quote unquote, enters our system, and we're going to draw this box around the soil system to make it kind of convenient, okay? So again, lightning and rainfall can fix nitrogen that gets deposited either through wet deposition or dry deposition from the atmosphere. Nitrogen can get fixed through fertilizer, or it can get fixed through legumes and or a non-symbiotic relationship. Okay, so these are all different possible pathways for nitrogen to enter that soil system. Of course, plants dying or just plant residue and animal residues, manures, etc., all have nitrogen in them and form the basis. Okay, so there's new additions coming into the system. All right. Number two, and most of these, I guess I should say, are in that organic form. If they're coming from legumes or from microorganisms or from plant residues, they're in that organic system. So here in this diagram, soil organic matter just has this kind of generic box drawn around it. So it's essentially everything organic. So it includes plant residue, manure. It includes microbial biomass. That could be, all of the critters in the soil: fungi, bacteria, protozoa, actinomycetes, algae, nematodes, micro and mesofauna, etc. And what might be thought of as stable humus. This is, a bit of a dated concept, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. But suffice it to say that soil organic matter is in a lot of different forms, and it's constantly shape-shifting and cycling in and out of more available forms, less available forms, et cetera, et cetera. So it's incredibly complex. Okay, so that's our organic piece, right? Now, when it goes from this organic fraction to the inorganic, it's through this process called mineralization, okay? So organic N is converted to inorganic N, i.e. ammonium, via mineralization, okay? So mineralization includes this aminization step and then ammonification step. And there's a lot of these kind of jargony words in the nitrogen cycle, but it's helpful to think ammonification is really the production of ammonia, NH4, right? So that makes sense. Taking it from an amine group, if you go back to organic chem, to a ammonium molecule. So it's this ammonification, okay? So collectively that process from an organic to an inorganic form is mineralization. And this happens when microbes or plants excrete waste. It happens when plants or microbe cells die, and it gets converted over. So there's a lot of different ways that this happens, or a lot of different organisms and processes involved in this step. Okay, so that was number 2, this idea of mineralization. Now, nitrification, similar to the fact that ammonification is the production of ammonium, nitrification is the production of nitrate. And nitrification, we just talked about this, right? Does this look familiar? NH4 to NO2 to NO3. So it's this idea of oxidizing a reduced form of nitrogen into an oxidized state. Microbes are constantly driving this reaction because they're getting energy in the chemical bonds between NH4, and when they pull those off and oxidize it with O2, oxygen, they're getting energy and they're living off that, right? And so we humans don't have the capacity to derive energy that way. We derive all of our energy, or nearly all of it, through respiration, burning sugars, and through carbon dioxide as a waste product. But here, nitrifying bacteria are constantly finding ammonium and oxidizing it to get energy and forming nitrate with that. Okay, so that's number 3, and that's called nitrification. You can see this nitrate NO2 minus step that happens as well. And there's different organisms involved, with that enzymatically. So here we are to 4. Okay, 4 is nitrate and ammonium in solution. Once we have that in solution, once those 2 forms of nitrogen are in solution, then there's a lot of possible fates for that, okay? Now, the reality is that, we can understand that this is a conceptual diagram, and everything is nice and evenly boxed off to help us think about this. But the reality is that all of this is, spatially interwoven in terms of the plant soil atmospheric matrix, right? It's like it's all mixed up together in the soil. There's not these nice little boxes, of course, that exist in the soil. So the soil solution, this number 4 on this diagram, is all that is just soil water. It's soil moisture, right? It's the water that's held in macropores or around soil surfaces in micropores, or on the the kind of the encompassing the soil minerals. And when we have soil in that nitrate or ammonium form, it can be subject to several fates. So one of the fates is that, hey, look, a microbe needs some nitrogen, it's going to take that out of solution. It's going to basically transport that nitrogen across its membrane, and it's going to incorporate that into a protein or to a nucleic acid or something. So this is the idea of immobilization. So number 5 is immobilization, and that is simply taking. It's the exact opposite of mineralization. So mineralization from organic to inorganic, and immobilization from an inorganic, i.e. in the solution, to an organic form. And this is, this idea of like microbes or plants embodying nitrogen. It's taking it up and making it part of their tissue. And that's the whole process of immobilization. These reactions are really important in soil because they can determine to a large degree nitrogen availability for a growing crop. Okay, so 5 is immobilization. 6 then. 6 is when we're in nitrate form. Nitrate is an anion. It's negatively charged, and because of that, it can be easily lost to groundwater, right? We talked about cation exchange, and there's a lot of majority of exchange sites in soil are negatively charged. Opposites attract, not similars, right? And so nitrate with water will actually leach out of the groundwater and can be lost out of the system. Okay, this is a major source of nitrogen loss. We can have ammonium from the soil solution get fixed into kind of clay surfaces, right? So these are can be a number of different ways that this happens, but similar to other cations, calcium, magnesium, fixing into clay minerals, clay surfaces, ammonium, NH4 plus as a cation can do the same. So it can get kind of fixed as well. Okay, so hang on, folks. We're almost there. Okay, we got just a few more to get through, and we'll really have kind of got this nailed down. So ammonium fixation in clay minerals, that's number 7. Moving on to 8 is this idea of volatilization. Okay, so volatilization is an atmospheric loss when NH4 gets converted to NH3 from ammonium to ammonia at the soil surface, or through into macropores into the air spaces in soil can get lost through the atmosphere through NH3. So this is a gas that can just essentially get lost. All right. It goes up into the atmosphere. It often forms with other compounds and then might ultimately get deposited. But to this kind of box the soil system, this represents a net loss. And then finally, number 9 is a complex microbial-driven process. Really, it's denitrification. Okay, so I mentioned that microbes are driving nitrification from ammonium to nitrate. Well, then another set of microorganisms are again kind of harvesting the energy that's in nitrate, nitrite, NO2, nitrous oxide, and then ultimately N2. Okay, but it's often not perfectly converted, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. But all these species of nitrogen, nitrous oxide, N2O or NO, or dinitrogen gas can all get lost. This is kind of collectively a process known as denitrification. So these are really net losses, volatilization and denitrification. Okay. So the thing with nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle is that nearly all of the transformations are driven by enzymes that are produced by microbes. So it is absolutely 100% accurate to say that the nitrogen cycle in soil is driven by microorganisms. It is a microbially mediated cycle, and that's very, very important to understand about nitrogen. So soil biology and biogeochemistry mediate nitrogen cycling, nitrogen availability, and nitrogen, as we just discussed earlier, has a disproportionately large influence on primary production in ecosystems, and so if A plus B and B, or A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C in that microbes, soil biology, to a large extent, influence and drive primary production in the globe. And that should really not come as any large surprise, but it's really important to keep in mind, and it's one of the major reasons that soil microbiology and soil biology in general is a really important piece of the puzzle to understand and to always think about when we're thinking about soil fertility. Okay, I will end there.